Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ethan Orfe, and we're going to get right into some fantasy news, speculations, because it is, in fact, championship week. And there's going to be a lot of stress for a lot of people. Unfortunately for me, I didn't make it to the championship round in any of my leagues this year. I got eliminated last week. But we do not dwell on the past because it's time to focus on the present. And in order to do that, we're going to have to evaluate what we saw last week. So let's look at some of the biggest fantasy performances and some of the most underwhelming fantasy performances from last week. So with that said, let's look at Kenyon Drake. Kenyon Drake had the craziest fantasy season. It's turnaround story. He got his first win against the Cleveland Browns, and it was amazing because he scored 4 touchdowns. He actually was single-handedly the reason why I lost in fantasy in one league. It was a horrendous display of domination from the opponent I went up against. However, Kenyon Drake was the captain of that ship. 39 fantasy points. Ever since he's gotten to the Cardinals via trade from Miami, he has been rejuvenated. He looks like the guy that was scouted coming out of Alabama, who he was supposed to be. He's catching out of the backfield. He's running hard. He's hitting the hole. And he's looking very hungry. On a team that season is essentially over, but they're still trying to get some reps in their offense with their new quarterback acquisition via the draft, Kyler Murray, and trying to get them acquainted. And it looks like it's going to get something nice out of that. I would definitely look into what Kenyon Drake has to offer for the remainder of the season. This week, the Cardinals face the Seahawks, and that might be an interesting matchup for that team. The Cardinals are not a team that lays over. They definitely try to play hard, and they show a lot of grit when they do play. So I expect to see a good amount of production coming out of Kenyon Drake for the remainder of the season, and especially this week coming up, as it is championship week. The next big-time performance, of course, is a regular around these parts, Christian McCaffrey. Now, Christian McCaffrey is the best fantasy back, I should say, in football. He, in the last 12 out of 14 games, has gotten 21 or more fantasy points, and this is PPR, so points per reception, and that is phenomenal. He might be the whole offense. He might be the offensive coordinator for fantasy. If your season revolved around Christian McCaffrey, you had a good time, and everybody else who didn't end up getting picked up around him, so the Saquons, the Alvin Kamaras, everybody who drafted those guys and didn't draft Christian McCaffrey, it must be a tough time for them. I know it was a tough time for me. All that being said, Christian McCaffrey had a 37 fantasy point performance in a loss last week, but it just shows that down the stretch of the season, they're not going to rest Christian McCaffrey, it seems like. It looks like they're going to let him continue to take a big load of that offense because their quarterback is still very young and he needs somebody to lean on, and that person is going to be Christian McCaffrey. Now, if we look at who the Panthers are going up against, it's the Colts. And seeing the Colts coming off that Monday night performance, Christian McCaffrey might have a really nice day out of the backfield, out of the catching situations, going into flat routes. Because Alvin Kamara, although he didn't have the best fantasy day, he did see a lot of production on the field to help his team successfully win that game. And you have other weapons around Christian McCaffrey like DJ Moore and Greg Olsen and others. And it looks like it's going to be run of the mill for Christian McCaffrey. He looks like he's going to go and get the numbers that he's been usually getting. So I would expect to see a pretty decent to really good performance. He has a very low floor and almost a bottomless ceiling. Now on to the most underwhelming performances. So Odell Beckham Jr. has had one of the most underwhelming fantasy seasons I've ever seen out of a superstar, out of somebody who has elite talent, one of the most talented wide receivers in the last 10 years to come into the league. And ever since he's come to Cleveland, it just hasn't worked out for him. There's been a lot of rumors going around that he's been asking people to leave, take me out of here, come get me. And this isn't the only wide receiver on that Cleveland squad that has said this reportedly, as Jarvis Landry also has been reported to say similar things in last week's game against the Cardinals. All that being said, Odell had a very pedestrian day against the Cardinals. I believe he had under 7 fantasy points on the day, and that's in PPR, mind you. So just imagine somebody who really needed to depend on Odell Beckham bust-out performance, and it just didn't happen. But who do we really blame for putting Odell in our starting lineup at this point? You know, we always have this idea that starting our studs is always the best choice because you're going to feel a lot worse sitting one of your main guys and they go off because you feel like somebody on your bench will perform better due to people going into slumps, bad matchups. But then someone will break out and you look stupid and you have egg on your face because you didn't trust the guy who is a top talent in the league, and you're trying to play the big number fantasy game, the galaxy brain mindset. You know, it's tough. But I think it's time to look in the mirror, as I also was an Odell Beckham fantasy owner, and it's time to face the facts. Odell has just not been that good this season. And there can be a lot of factors that go into that. So that could mean Freddie Kitchens when it comes to play calling. That could mean Baker Mayfield. He's not being the best quarterback he could be right now. That could be offensive line. It just may be Odell not being 100% healthy, as has been reported that he may have been playing with a sports hernia for a large portion of this season. There's a lot of factors in Cleveland that's going on that can bring up a lot of attention that a lot of people aren't looking into anymore. Now it just seems like a circus, a media circus. But as far as when it comes to fantasy, it just seems that it's time to stay away from Cleveland players outside of Nick Chubb and the occasional Jarvis Landry start when he does get the ball a little bit better. The next underwhelming performance, I would have to say, has to be Phillip Lindsay. Now, Phillip Lindsay has been a little bit up and down for the whole season, but last week against Kansas City was probably rock bottom for any Phillip Lindsay owner, especially if you were in the semifinals of the fantasy football playoffs, as I was. I owned Phillip Lindsay, and it was very an emotional day if you had him, because he just didn't get it going. And to be honest, the Broncos just didn't get going. I can't say that I blame this, or this was a bad Phillip Lindsay game, outside of just the numbers facts, of course. But it just might have been just a bad Broncos game offensively in general. As you know, Drew Lock is carrying the torch right now for their offense. And outside of Cortland Sutton really getting the most out of that offense in last week's game, no one really could get it going, and Kansas City controlled that game from start to finish. Now, I don't know what that exactly means for Philip Lindsay remainder of the season, but it's just something to look at. I hope he turns it around for him. Coming up, we're going to talk a little bit about filling the void, the injury void, as a lot of players got hurt, banged up, and we're going to look at some waiver wire pickups that could help you secure the W for your fantasy season. Coming right up.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. As last time we talked about some big-time performances from last week and a little bit underwhelming ones from the semis of last week. And now we're going to look into how we can structure our teams and lineups in order to optimally win the championship the best way we can. And that is to handle any injuries, any people underperforming. And really the only way to do that now is to look at the waivers. So let's check out what we can find on the waiver wires. First, we're going to look at who we need to be paying attention to as far as injury reports, as the big news is coming out that Josh Jacobs is going to be ruled out for this upcoming game. And it's kind of disappointing, but last week he was clearly not 100%. He was playing hurt, and honestly, it might have even hurt their team, and it could definitely hurt their chances as a playoff contender carrying on. I hope for a speedy recovery. So let's look at the Raiders. They play the Chargers coming up, and the Chargers have been a really up and down team, and it's been on a down slope for quite a bit of time right now. And you can only think that the Raiders are in a similar position, but there's a lot more upside of thinking that the Raiders can pull this out. But without Josh Jacobs, you never really know what's going to be happening, especially with someone like Derek Carr, who can be a bit hit or miss every given Sunday. Next on the injury list to watch is Dalvin Cook. He has not been ruled out yet. However, coming out of the Minnesota camp, Mike Zimmer was very, very optimistic that he will be ready to go on Sunday, but that's just something to be watching out for, and we're going to get into in a little bit later why you should be thinking about picking up their backup Mike Boone. The next player, of course, is everybody's fantasy darling who has drafted him, picked him up on waivers in the early parts of the season, which was Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin is still doubtful, undetermined. It might be a game time decision. The Bucs haven't really said a whole lot on the situation. However, it's just something to look out for. And you know the big name coming out of this whole Buccaneers camp for fantasy purposes is Brashad Perriman. Now, Brashad Perriman had a thunderous game last week. And, of course, that's not hard to think about, as Jameis Winston has been on an absolute tear when it comes to passing yards, touchdowns, as well as interceptions. But interceptions aside, Jameis is getting the ball to any receiver talent that he can find, and they seem to be thriving with Jameis, and that team seems to be really clicking on offense week in and week out. So what does that really mean for the waiver wires? Who should we be looking at? what should be the determining factor on who gets on your waivers and who doesn't. Now, I'm going to stick with Brashad Perriman for a little bit. So let's look at Brashad Perriman's situation. Mike Evans has been ruled out already. Chris Godwin has been undetermined thus far coming out of the Buccaneers camp. Last week against a seamlessly pedestrian Lions defense, had the biggest game of his career, saw 90% of the offensive snaps last week, and just had a monster game, 3 touchdowns. And the rest of the wide receiver core does not look like they're going to be able to compete for this number 1 spot that Brashad definitely played to earn last week. So when looking at the landscape of what could transpire, this might be really big game potential for Brashad because he's playing against a Texans team that typically can give up a lot of points. Their defense isn't always as consistent, especially without their premier pass rusher J.J. Watt being out. It can be a little bit troublesome for them to get stops. And Jameis, as you know, he can be hit or miss, a little Jekyll and Hyde, if you will, about passing touchdowns and throwing interceptions. But the evidence is in the stats. Jameis is getting the ball down the field to any wide receiver he can do. And that would mean that Brashad Perriman is absolutely a must-grab no matter what the situation is. I'm sure there's somebody on your bench that you've just been holding on to, maybe like a A.J. Green, that you just don't need anymore. He's already been ruled out for the season as well, so you might as well try and dip your hands really quickly to get Brashad Perriman. Next on the list for players you might need to consider picking up is another wide receiver in Anthony Miller out of Chicago. Anthony Miller, since coming back from injury, has had a really, really good reception and yards average on about 10 targets per game. And he has really no competition for targets on that team anymore, as we still see that Taylor Gabriel is still sidelined with an injury. And although that Mitch Trubisky isn't playing at his best level yet, the production is still there for Anthony Miller, and that's something to always watch. The Bears do play the Chiefs defense, and they've allowed the 6th most receptions to any slot wideouts this year. So if you have lost to Chris Godwin, he's somebody you should also look into. But now into one of the players that might be a little bit of a situational ad. Especially if you are a Dalvin Cook owner. If you own Dalvin Cook, or if you're just looking to replace someone like a Josh Jacobs, you might need to go ahead and look at a Mike Boone, only because last week he definitely seemed to get a lot of touches. However, I would be very wary of his bang or bust potential. It's very possible that he might just be the bell cow to move the ball, but I highly doubt they're going to be running their offense to get him more looks, more touches, rather than just to control clock and to keep time pushing. As he only really got 5 catches out of the backfield in passing situations last week. And to be fair, Minnesota had that game locked and loaded from very early on, and they might have just been trying to run the clock out by running the ball a bit more, and they didn't really need to pass out of the backfield to their backup running back. However, I would look at their other running back that came in, Abdullah, who got 6 touches, so there might be some bit of a catching out of the backfield situation that you might need to check out. It might hurt Boone's overall potential if he is just going to be the bell cow on 1st and 2nd down, and Abdullah comes in at 3rd down, and he dominates the passing game, especially if you are in a PPR league. If you're in standard, you might want to roll with Boone. But if you're in PPR, you may want to take a second look and find another option to go to while looking to fill out your injury problems, or if you feel like your depth at running back isn't as best as you would like it to be. Now, just a little bit of more news to come out as far as other injuries, other replacements, what you can look at. O.J. Howard is a nice look against the Texans, as the Buccaneers are very injury-riddled, and they have a lot of holes to fill and a lot of voids on their own offense that they need to find in other people. O.J. Howard is a really talented receiving tight end, and he might be able to help get some balls down the field for Jameis. He's definitely a big target, so if there is any touchdown situations, red zone situations, they might be looking at O.J. Howard a little bit more this week. So that's just something to think about if you have some tight end issues. You might want to rock the double tight end strategy if you don't have another wide receiver to put in that flex or running back. That might be another option to look at for you. Coming up after this break, we're going to look into matchup breakdowns across the league. We're going to see who could have a big game, who might not have a big game, and just where the fantasy points are going to come from. Coming right up.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, where last time we talked a little bit about injuries, filling the void, how can we replace the people that we once loved, and now where do we look to get them, which would be the waiver wire. And now we're going to look at some matchup breakdowns across the league and some big games according to fantasy to look at, so that way we all come out on top in our championship title matches. So first matchup we're going to look at is the Seattle Seahawks going up against the Cardinals. Now, the Seahawks have two really good wide receivers. One, Tyler Lockett, who is a dynamic down the field, big speed wide receiver. He's been great throughout the season, had a little bit of a slump, but is coming back and had a really good week last week. And DJ Metcalf, the rookie, who at first was a little bit underwhelming, but now seems to be turning it on a little bit. And the Cardinals defense might be able to jumpstart somebody's fantasy season to a new level. So the Cardinals defense is statistically the worst defense in the NFL. And they are the worst defense in passing yards per game, as they give up 290 passing yards per game. What does that really mean? Well, that means that either they're not getting a good pass rush when it comes to the front seven, or their safeties and corners are not being able to communicate and lock down wide receivers consistently, and that leads to big plays. And they're a young team, and they're trying to figure things out. But what does that mean for fantasy? Now, for fantasy, that means that Russell Wilson, Tyler Lockett, and of course DJ Metcalf are just primed and ready to have a really big performance. Now, I'm not expecting to have a breakout performance like a Brashad Perriman out of someone like DJ Metcalf. However, it's very possible for him to have a very, very productive day. And like I always say, productivity in fantasy is the number one thing. looking at someone like Courtland Sutton, he hasn't had a huge breakout game, but maybe 1 or 2 times this season. But he was always in my starting lineup because he was dependable, he was consistent, and he was able to get touches because he was able to get open. And if somebody can get open and can be guaranteed to get a few touches, that's someone you can't always look down upon. And when you need points, you got to go where the points are going to be given. And I think that there's going to be a lot of points given up in this game by the Cardinals defense, and it's something to just be made aware of. The next game is going to be about the Bills versus the Patriots. The thing about this matchup that intrigues me is the defensive potential. And the Bills and Patriots are very similar on defense. The Bills are basically right under the Patriots in rushing yards per game and passing yards per game. Now, the Patriots defense is probably the best defense statistically in the league. Besides the 49ers, they're second in almost everything else. And the secondary is top class. Stephon Gilmore is probably going to win Defensive Player of the Year if he continues the tear he's been on. And on the opposite side, from the Buffalo Bills perspective, Tre'Davious White is also in the running for Defensive Player of the Year, as well as he has had an amazing season too. Now, both of these defenses love to get after people, get after the football, close out, tackle, make plays while the ball is in the air, and they don't let opportunities go by the wayside when there's an opportunity to be made on that defensive side of the ball. So what does that mean for offensive players? In my humble opinion, I believe that this is a stay-away game. For majority of the players in this matchup, it's just not a lot of room to go around. Josh Allen's wide receivers are very short, but they have some speed. But to be honest, that's not what you want to do against New England. New England is not someone you want to be throwing the ball with. And knowing Bill Belichick, they're probably going to try and make them throw the ball against them. And that's just going to play right into their hands. So it's going to be tough to see someone like Devin Singletary get a lot of good touches out of the backfield. I haven't really been a big believer in Frank Gore as a fantasy option all season. And it's going to be really tough for someone like Josh Allen, who already has accuracy issues, to really get going and drive that team down the field against basically arguably the top defense in the NFL. On the flip side, though, the Patriots have had their own offensive struggles all season long. Their wide receiver group is not the best. Julian Edelman doesn't seem to be healthy, and they're depending on a rookie to really carry a lot of the load in the receiving game. Their running game has been kind of pedestrian with Sony Michel, as it just hasn't looked good like last season, and it just really has boiled down over to, if Sony Michel's in the game, he's probably not catching the ball, and if he isn't in the game, James White is probably in the game, and you'd probably think he's going to be running routes, catching out of the backfield in the flat routes, so on and so forth. And Tom Brady, to be honest, has not been the Tom Brady that we saw even from last year, who we thought was a little bit hit or miss. This is a little bit more of that regression that we expected to see in a Tom Brady who is 40 plus years old. What more can you really expect from a man who's that old playing in the league? This is his umpteenth season in the league, and you got to remember that. That's a factor. He's been in deep playoff runs for a very long time, on a very long playoff streak, and that adds up. Now, that might mean he's a little bit more seasoned and he can go out and win a defensive game like this, and I wouldn't be the one to not pick the Patriots against the Bills. However, it's just something to think about. If that Bills defense really wants to make their presence felt, they're going to do it on the field, and they're going to get after Brady, and they're going to make Bill Belichick try and beat them too. So if it was me, I would particularly stay away from some of these Bills players, especially someone like Devin Singletary, Josh Allen, John Brown. It's just really tough for me to see somebody really break out. And you never really know with the Patriots. You may want to start Sony Michel just because if you can do anything against the Buffalo Bills a little bit, it is running the football, because that's not their best way of stopping people. As you can saw last week against the Steelers, we saw James Conner really get going after coming back from injury, so that might be something to look at. But other than that, I would say this is majorityist. Next, I would be looking at the Texans versus the Buccaneers, as I've already spoken previously about the Buccaneers' potential with Rashad Perriman and O.J. Howard to really get going in the passing game and make a big game out of this. Why do I think about this in this way, you might ask? And that is because the Texans are a bit wishy-washy when it comes to defense. Now, their passing defense is not very good. They're in the bottom half of the league, where they averaged 266 passing yards against per game. Now, that might just be the recipe for disaster if you're going up against someone like Rashad Perriman, O.J. Howard, Jameis Winston. That just might be an offensive explosion, because the Texans' offense is also really good when they're on all cylinders. So we just saw the kind of culmination of Carlos Hyde. He's been having a sneaky good season, going to be a 1,000-yard rusher, and he had a really good game last week. And to be honest, the Buccaneers defense is not the prettiest and not the shiniest either. Although they have a really good run defense, their passing defense is equally as pedestrian, as they are third last in passing defense and passing yards allowed. So this might just be a bombshell of a game where everybody's just throwing big yardage passes down the field. DeAndre Hopkins might have a humongous game. He definitely has the potential to do it. Someone like Will Fuller, who has recently come back. And with Will Fuller in that offense looks totally different. They look dynamic. They look like they can move the ball down the field. And we all know about Deshaun Watson's big play ability. He does it day in and day out. Last week he wasn't having the best game, but he was able to make a lot of things happen for that team, and it was able to be seen. All right, so coming up, we're going to talk about who makes your starting lineup for the championship round, and I have 4 players with championship swinging upside for you to be able to do that. Coming right up.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts. Past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Last time we talked about some matchup breakdowns across the league, and now we're going to get into who is going to be the guy that's going to swing your championship game. Now, I've been looking at a few different players, of course. We talked about some players like Tyler Lockett, DJ Metcalf, Rashad Perriman, people like that we've already spoken about. But I wanted to get into some people that you may already have on your team that you may want to stick in that starting lineup because the potential of them having a big game is very likely. So, first, I'm going to talk about Miles Sanders, the running back out of Philadelphia. He has come alive a little bit, along with most of the Eagles' offense, as they've been going to Zach Ertz a little bit more. Now their wide receivers are all hurt, and they have been trying to do it all by committee, really. Whoever they can put out there and play, they'll put out there, and hopefully they can get the job done. Miles Sanders has been a bit of a fantasy hit or miss, as in the early part of the season, people were expecting a lot of things out of many people in the Eagles offense, and that just didn't turn out to be the case. But now he is seemingly finding his stride in the NFL, understanding his role, and knows how to make things work. And he's always been known to be very dynamic when he touches the ball. It was more so how he was being utilized, and now it seems like he's finding a stride on how he can affect games at a more consistent level. Going up against a Cowboys defense that, against the run, they are pretty good. They have they have about 103 yards per game against the run. So that doesn't really mean a lot without looking at the Cowboys' passing yards, which are 220 yards per game that they give up as well. Now, what does that exactly mean for Miles Sanders? That just means that it's doable. He can make some things work. And when you have a quarterback with the talent of Carson Wentz, anything really is possible for you because he has the ability to make big plays. And when you have a quarterback that can make big plays, a running back out of the backfield that can make some big plays, a tight end of the quality of Zach Ertz, anything can really happen. It's a rivalry game. It's a really big game as far as playoff potential when it comes to the NFC East. It's just a big recipe for somebody to come out and break out that you wouldn't really expect to break out. So most people are expecting a good game from Dak, Ezekiel Elliott, Amari Cooper, people like that, Zach Ertz. But to be honest, if you really look at it, you might be able to see something that can come out of this for Miles Sanders. So that's just a person I would be having an eye on if you feel like you need a little bit of a pop and you can have trust in a guy that might be able to get it done for you. The next player I would like to bring up is Courtland Sutton, who has been a fantasy savior for a lot of people just because of how consistent he is. Courtland Sutton is on a team that honestly is not one of the best offensive teams in the league, but he has been able to be productive in that without scoring the ball and being able to really look like a wide receiver 2 to wide receiver 1 on any given Sunday, even though matchups may not always be in his favor. Now, with that said, there is a matchup this week coming up in his favor, and he's going to be going up against a secondary that is not the best, as in the Lions. And the Lions secondary, if I'm not mistaken, is second to last in the NFL by giving up passing yards. They give up 288 per game, and that's just a recipe for disaster for them if Courtland Sutton can get going. Now, the Broncos are not as bad as their record may seem. They've been in a lot of close games. They play very hard. They have a really good coach, in my opinion, and they're just trying to figure a lot of things out. And Drew Lock seems to be the guy that they're going to roll with for at least the remainder of the season. And Drew Lock can get the ball to him. So we're going to see what can really happen with Courtland Sutton. I think that he's a really quality start at the wide receiver 2 or even your flex. And he might get you at least 10 points just on catches alone. He might see a good volume of catches coming in his way. Next, I'd like to talk about Julio Jones. Julio is a guy who, if you drafted him at the beginning of the season, things were looking a little bit bleak, especially if it was not PPR. If it was standardized scoring, it was looking very bleak, and you really didn't understand why things were happening the way they were. When you did draft Julio, especially if he was one of your first rounders, it was not looking the best situation. However, if you made it to this point, congratulations, first of all. That's a big accomplishment for fantasy owners to make it to the championship round. And Julio seems to be turning it on at all cylinders. He's been getting in the end zone. He's been catching an absurd rate. And he just looks like he is ready to play. Now, the Falcons' season is essentially over with. They're not going to be in any type of playoff contention. However, it doesn't seem like they're going to be playing for a better draft position, at least as of yet. So when it comes to fantasy implications, you have one more game to go for league settings. If you play FanDuel or DraftKings doing daily fantasy, it still continues on. But for standard 10-man, 12-man, 14-man leagues, this is a really good opportunity for Julio to have one of the defining games of his season, and probably the most defining game for his season thus far. The Falcons this week go up against the Jaguars, who honestly have not had the best secondary, especially since their top-class cornerback was traded to the Rams, as in Jalen Ramsey. No pun intended. However, Julio is a all-star caliber receiver. He was just voted to the Pro Bowl again, so he'll be seen out there if he does decide to play. And he just knows how to get the job done. He's always open. Even if he's not, he is always open. You can always trust in a guy like Julio to get there and get that ball. The last but not least member on this list is Darren Waller, the tight end for the Oakland Raiders. He has had a phenomenal season, not only for fantasy, but also just for himself, as his story has been so wonderful to see him conquer over the drug addiction and being able to be in the league and stay in the league and also be productive and be one of the best tight ends in the game right now, especially on the receiving end of things. Now, the Raiders are down a big weapon, which would be Josh Jacobs, their rookie running back, who seemingly might have been Offensive Rookie of the Year. And they are going up against the Chargers, who have been a little bit of a mess in recent time. Their offense has been very inconsistent, even though the yardage would not say so, because Phillip Rivers is still in the top 3 in the league in passing yards, but they just have not been able to score or capitalize on any of those yardage. There's been a lot of mistakes, interceptions, and so on and so forth. But that just means that their defense gets out on the field a little bit more, and that might mean that Darren Waller might have a good game. He already has really good games majority of the time. I've never seen a Darren Waller game where I question whether or not he was hurt or if he was just not having a good game or the matchups were weird. He always seems to be able to be open and get the ball. Now, scoring might be a bit of an issue. However, the Chargers have given up a lot of points in recent weeks, and I don't know if that's due to just people not being healthy or just being on the field too much has been detriment to their efforts on trying to win these games and giving up a lot more points. Of course, turnovers play a large factor in that as well. So looking into that, Darren Waller might be able to get in the end zone this time. And if he gets in the end zone, the scoring might be through the roof because he can really have a big impact. And he doesn't really get as many touches as you would like in that offense, but he gets enough to where it's always a quality start. And if you have him and another tight end such as Travis Kelce, you could run that double tight end situation, and that could be really, really deadly going into championship week as tight ends become more and more valuable as the weeks go along. And that's in the playoffs, and that's in any other game when it comes to the last few weeks of the season. Coming up, we're going to talk a little bit about some FanDuel, some DraftKings. You know what that means, some daily fantasy coming up soon.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, where last time we talked about who might be able to swing a game of all games, the championship game in your fantasy league. And now we're going to go and turn the tide a little bit and talk about some daily fantasy. A little bit more of the lower stakes, as you can always go back and play it again via DraftKings, FanDuel, wherever you play your fantasy football preference. We're going to get into who is a good bang for your buck player That's going to save you a couple dollars down the road because, you can always go draft your Christian McCaffreys, your Lamar Jacksons, and so many different studs, of course. But, there's a limit to these type of studs. You can't draft them all or else there'd be no point in playing it. So we got to look at who you can get good value out of, this isn't necessarily who is going to have a tremendous breakout game, but who isn't going to wet the bed per se, who isn't going to let you down when you need it most, when you need those 10 extra points to be able to get back into the winning pool and make a little bit of money back in your daily fantasy games. So we're going to be looking at a few different ones. So I know a little bit earlier we talked about the Chargers' struggles, but we're going to look at Phillip Rivers as a potential bang for your buck quarterback just because of the yardage potential. He has been able to stay in the top 5 of passing yards this whole season. So he's throwing the ball quite a lot. I believe last game he threw the ball at least 50 times. And you're going to get a lot of yards out of that. Now, that doesn't always mean he's going to get in the end zone, especially passing-wise, because you can see through reflections of other players along that side of the ball. Like Keenan Allen hasn't been himself of recent. Neither has Melvin Gordon. Hit or miss when it comes to Austin Eckler and Hunter Henry. But Phillip Rivers has been able to produce some good yardage. Now, the matchup for Phillip Rivers is a little bit of a favorable one, as they're going to go up against Oakland, whose defense has not been the best, and they can definitely give up some points, and their offense isn't as consistent as you would like them to be. So he might see the ball a little bit more this time around, and he has a really big gunslinging nature, so he'll be able to sling the ball around to whoever he needs to be able to get the job done. Now, does that mean he's going to have a barn burner of a game, have 50 fantasy points? No, it doesn't mean that. But does that mean he'll be able to be a serviceable quarterback that might be the league average for this coming week? And if that's all you need, and you have someone like a Christian McCaffrey next to him, or someone like Dalvin Cook if he does come out to play, or even a big-time wide receiver like Michael Thomas, any of those guys will be able to carry the load for you in scoring in the first place. Because as we know, daily fantasy is not always about who can give you all the big points. Because in regular standard leagues, the idea is always to draft people who are going to be stout, amazing people, right? That could be snake drafts or auction drafts. You want to get the best potential players that will always perform at their highest potential. That's the dream. That's the idea. In daily fantasy, it's about getting good players that are going to produce, have good numbers on average, and get them as cheap as possible, knowing that you're going to get a few bell cows to be able to hold down the fort that you can depend on. And at that point, it's about who you know is going to be able to get the job done around them. So it's more like building a team like basketball. You know, you want to get that big star and you want to build your team around that star rather than having all the superstars at one team, which is kind of funny because this is fantasy. So the next player I would suggest is someone we also brought up a little bit earlier, which is Phillip Lindsay. Now, Phillip Lindsay is going up against a Detroit defense that is not very good, and he could be due for a very nice game. And although his season has not been the best in recent weeks, as he had a season low in yardage and attempts, but the volume is not the issue here, and you should be able to exploit a matchup like this very easily. So his net cost is looking to be about $5,300, and that's pretty serviceable for a good back that at any given moment could get in the end zone, get 2 touchdowns, see a lot of production out of the backfield, and he might be able to help Drew Lock calm himself. And that's something that you should never take lightly. A running back is like having a tight end when it comes to quarterbacks, just because it gives them a sense of structure. Running the ball gives every team a sense of structure. And it's not necessarily a passing security blanket like a tight end would be, but it's a certain type of security to know that not everything should be on the quarterback all the time. Now, of course, they run the offenses, they call the plays, but ultimately, if your running back is able to pick up 4 yards a carry, they're doing their job. And I think Philip Lindsay is obviously talented enough to do that. So if it would be me, I would be looking at Philip Lindsay to pick up just because of the potential of making a good run at it. Next, I would be looking at on the Miami side, as Devontae Parker has had a resurgence of a career since Miami has turned it around a little bit. I mean, they're still not winning a lot of games at all. However, their play has improved. They look like a football team now. As you know, in national media, a lot of people criticize them for looking like a purposeful tanking, and it doesn't seem like that would be the case now. They look like they are a formidable team in the NFL. They can play. They have been playing, and they've been trying to win games, and that's also due to having someone like Devontae Parker out at the wide receiver position who has had a amazing stretch of games recently. He's the reason why a lot of people have been going to the championship this year coming off of waivers, because he was on the waivers for quite some time, like most Miami wideouts and other skill positions, because why would you pick a Miami skill position during a time where it looked like they did not want to try and be competitive in a league this year, potentially for draft capital? So why do I say Devontae Parker? It is definitely something to look into, because he is going up against a team that really is in the same position as them, as in the Bengals. The Bengals are basically trying to secure the Joe Burrow Bowl, if you know what that means. So they're definitely in play for trying to get a high draft pick. So that doesn't mean that they're not going to try and go win out a football game, but it definitely means that they are not in the best shape to win football games. So that means that Devontae Parker is going to have a really good game. Their secondary is not the best. If you really look at the stats, Cincinnati is just not a very good defensive team. They're very middle of the run. Now, they're very middle of the run when it comes to the passing game, but it can get really out of hand for them because their quarterback has been very turnover prone recently, and Miami is a team that can be a little bit feisty and can catch a lot of people slipping. So I wouldn't be surprised if he has a really good game and he could really be good for somebody. So if you have a little bit more money to spend in daily fantasy, I would look at a Devontae Parker as an option for you to come in at that flex spot, that wide receiver 2. He's not really a wide receiver 1 just yet, but it's definitely somebody to keep an eye on, to look at, and I would definitely look into him as being a very comparable player to put into those positions. Now, finally, there was one more that we're going to talk about real quick, is Danny Amendola, who plays for Detroit, and that's just somebody who might have a little bit more upside at a lower cost than somebody at Devontae Parker, because Devontae Parker, we kind of know his floor and ceiling, and we don't really know what exactly the ceiling would be for a Detroit wide receiver, as there's a lot of injuries going around, and he just might see a little bit more targets coming his way, especially against a Denver team that defense can be shaky at a little bit of the time. All right, so coming up, we're going to talk a little bit about what to do when you are in the championship round of the playoffs, how to handle it, just a little bit of advice.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. For last time, we were talking a little bit about daily fantasy, some sleeper pickups, some cost-effective guys, and now we're just gonna wind down a little bit and remember that it's just a game, as I'm gonna give you guys some advice on how to handle if you are in the championship round and how to handle the stress, as I've been in your shoes. I've been in championship rounds before where you're just on edge. Sunday is the worst day of the week for you because now your blood pressure is high. You don't know what to do. It's 12:55 Eastern Standard Time. So you are fiddling with players. You don't know who to start, who to sit. You don't know if you can trust this guy right now or if he's going to have a big game. And you don't know if your quarterback, you're trying to read matchups and you're looking so much into minute details and you're trying to predict who's going to be good. And let's just take a deep breath. Let's relax. Let's try to remember a few things. Rule number 1, when dealing with fantasy football in general, don't overthink the lineup. What do I mean by that? Not overthinking your lineup is essential because it just makes things a lot more easier to deal with in general. You can be a tinker. You can be somebody who thinks they know just the most optimal way to use all of their players on their team. But at the end of the day, it's still up to chance. You never know what someone's going to do, what's going to happen to somebody. Somebody might get hurt. Somebody just may have a rough game. Somebody might explode on your bench. You never know. But don't overthink the lineup to find the perfect way. You're not a predictor. You're not a genie. You're not a fortune teller. You can't see into the future. You can't make those type of predictions. So let's just calm down and trust your gut, Start your studs. Now, I know I said earlier that starting your studs can get you in a little bit of trouble sometimes, but let's be real. If your stud hasn't been that good for a very substantial amount of weeks, you can rest assured that he is not a stud this year. But every other time, start your studs. Trust that they are going to be able to get the ball, especially if they're on a team that is looking to go for a playoff push. Those are the best ways to get production out of people. When somebody's pushing for the playoffs, people tend to show out and show out really well. So, start your studs. That's tip number 1. Tip number 2, try to remember that you actually enjoy the game of football. So, this is about watching the games. Everybody gets caught up in let's look at Chris Hansen for the red zone. So that way we can see when all our players are going to be in the red zone and who's having big catches and big games. And, he is a very big, prominent figure in the fantasy football community. And what he does in that show is very good. And I watch it a lot every Sunday as well. But you got to remember that you have to enjoy football to like fantasy football as well. And there's a lot of times where we mistake that fantasy football is more than just a game. It's just a game within the game. And we love football. Isn't that right? We love playing football. We love watching football. We consume the media around football, the drama. We love the game. So let's just remind ourselves that we love the game. So let's just cool the brakes. Maybe put Chris Hansen down, maybe to the 3rd monitor. Maybe not the 1st or the 2nd monitor, maybe the 3rd or 4th if you rock 4 monitors to watch games. I watch maybe 2-3 games at a time, trying to look at who's doing well, what type of things I need to be looking at. But why don't you turn on that 1 o'clock game if you're on the East Coast? Look at your local channels. Watch some games. Enjoy football. Maybe not check fantasy every 3 minutes to see if the score has changed for you or not. It might just make you enjoy it just a little bit more and remind you why you got into it in the first place. Because believe me, last week I was on edge watching the Monday night game just because Alvin Kamara was on my team. He didn't have the best game. and I ended up losing by very, very small amount of points. I was very disappointed. I was really ready to go to the championship and try and make a run in winning the title. But as soon as I found out that that was just not going to be the case, that I was going to lose, and I came to accept that, there was this overwhelmingly peaceful feeling that came over me. And the game was still going on, and I could enjoy the game. Because it wasn't like Alvin Kamara played bad. He had a really good game as far as playing on the field, being able to get out there in space, make some people miss, which he hasn't been doing very often of recent. He looked a little bit better, looked healthier. And I really noticed that. But if you're just so riled up in fantasy football, that mindset, that world, you're just going to think that he's not good anymore, or he underperformed, so that means he sucks or he has low value. And that's just not the case. And sometimes you just have to separate the fact that, these are people, and people aren't always 100% all the time. The game is very nuanced. Life is very nuanced. But if you love football, you like watching it regardless. So just remember that. You like watching football. The last thing I would like to touch on is the idea of loss, losing. No one likes to lose. I don't like to lose, especially in fantasy. Losing in fantasy always hurts, always stinks, never feels good. Never feels good to lose. There are weeks where I might be having an amazing day, and that might be a Saturday or a Friday. But when Sunday comes around, it's always stressful. Sundays are very stressful for fantasy people. And if you lose, all that stress just boiled over into nothing good to come out of it. So you're just not only stressed, now you're just mad. And championship week it's amplified to another level. You feel on edge, like you're about to give a speech to over 1 million people or something. It's like the adrenaline rush of really wanting to be able to bring this home. You've been through it. You've been through 15 tough weeks of football, tooth and nail, pickups, ads, arguing with your league members about why that trade was bogus. And it all comes down to this day, this week. And if you lose, it's okay. I'm here to tell you this. Me, Ethan Orfe, at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, is here to tell you it's okay to lose. Now, do you want to lose? No, but it's okay. There's always next year. There's other outlets. Go find another hobby. Read. Go watch a new television show. Go watch more football. But there's other ways to get past it. It'll be okay. It's gonna sting for a little bit, but you can move on. You can even play daily fantasy if you really, really need that urge for the next week because you just feel like there was something missing, like you need closure. But if you lose, it's okay. Don't go in your group chats swearing and making a russ. Calm down. It's all right. The best man won that day, and now there's no real super competitive advantage sometimes. Sometimes it's just up to luck. You never know. But just remember this. Take a deep breath. Shake the man's hand if it's somebody in person. Or tell him congratulations for winning the league. Or just don't message them at all if you have nothing nice to say. So that's it. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask you to remember to subscribe to the podcast, write a nice review, leave 5 stars. That really helps us out. And also, can you please follow us on all social media platforms? That is Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you and have a good one. And good luck out there in all your fantasy endeavors.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.